And we are live, folks. I told you we would be back in the mix here. We're going to be talking a little random boxing history with 86 Boxing. I know, we would like to play on the names here, all that good stuff right there. So we appreciate everyone, those who are going to be joining back in, who were with us as a part of the Iman Khalif discussion. And now we're going to talk a little boxing history, centered on boxing history, dating way back, those eras where a lot of people don't really dive into them as much. But of course, if you're here, in all likelihood, you know what we're talking about. So salute to Angza in the building here. Salute to Angza Gaming Channel right there. Go follow him. Go follow my man right there, Angza. ANQZA. If you're gonna be listening or watching the replay, make sure to go follow him. He needs some subscribers. He's putting out great content over there. You even get to see a little fight night content, me putting in that work over there on fight night on the channel. So appreciate you there, Angza. And shout out to my man Dan. Says good evening, sports fans. Good evening there to you, Dan. Appreciate having you here, buddy. When it comes to boxing history, we love having you in the mix for sure. And of course, I want to send a shout out to my man, Just Frank, just dropped in. Salute to you, Just Frank. Appreciate you 100% there. We're talking boxing history here tonight, random boxing history. And it just so happened I have a guest with the namesake right there, Random Acoustic Thoughts. You can call it Random Boxing there. How's it going, Random? Glad to have you back in here once again.
Good to be back so soon, man. It must be, 30 minutes now since I talked to you. Yeah, it's good to be here, brother. Let me shoot you an interview question. So what kind of historical stuff you been looking at lately, man? I know you do the modern, you do the contemporary and the old school. But I've been following your shows. You've been putting on some good shows there with the panel discussions and whatnot. But I'm curious, what, if anything, of the old school you've been looking at of late?
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. I've been doing a lot of modern stuff, as mentioned. I definitely want to get back in the mix on some of the historic things that we're accustomed to discussing on the channel for sure, and I'm going to be tapping in on that. I can say that I'm working on a few things, or at least doing a little bit of research here. One of them is I'm reading the book, and I'm about halfway through it, as a matter of fact, or a little bit more than halfway through the Johnny Kilbane book by Mark Allen Baker. Shout out to Mark Allen Baker. He's come on the channel a couple of times, and this is his latest book. It's on the great featherweight Johnny Kilbane, a fighter who fought in the early 1910s and 20s. So if you want to be familiarized with the history during that era, then Johnny Kilbane is going to be a name that you want to familiarize yourself with. Held the title for 12 years, and that's the featherweight title for 12 years. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that is the longest reign at featherweight in boxing history. But of course, if I'm wrong, someone let me know. But I believe that is the case. 12 years there by Johnny Kilbane. Now, so that's one I'm really diving into, and it's been very interesting. Once I actually get through the entire book, I'm going to do a live discussion on it. I might have to get my buddy Mark back on here just so we can have a further discussion on Johnny Kilbane now that I have gained some knowledge on him by virtue of reading his book. Also, working on a very, very special project, a very, very special project. This stems back from a discussion I had with a relative of such, and I think it's going to be probably one of the better videos that I'll ultimately end up doing. I hadn't shared it except for with a couple of people, but I'll go ahead and share it here now. But I'll leave you with this. It's going to be tied to Kingfish Levinsky. So if you're not familiar with Kingfish, then go ahead and look him up and know that something is in the works right there. Kingfish Levinsky. So those are probably the two areas that have had the most of my attention here as it relates to historic content here recently. Outside of that, the use, always looking into old boxing videos, checking out some historic fights, things of that nature. It was just not too long ago As a matter of fact, this past week, I was watching some historic videos that included the likes of guys like Barney Ross, of course. You know, if you don't know Barney Ross, get familiarized with him. The last video I watched was Max Smelling taking on Jack Sharkey in what was a robbery from all indications in the second contest that the two fought where the belt exchanged hands. But hey, good is what it is. We know how the history prevailed there, but always tuning into the history aspect of it there, Random. So I appreciate you with the question there. And I know you've been up to some stuff. So what's been on your plate as of late there, Random?
All right. There's going to be a lot of background noise. I'm literally on a bus, but I've been on early 1908, well, late 07, early 1908 on the Sam Langford group, trying to figure out, this was in the lead up to his April 1908 fight. I'm sorry, 1910. It was leading up to his April 1910 fight with Stanley Catchell. He had the two fights, his second and third fight against Jim Flynn out in California. And the first one was in LA. And a San Francisco promoter wanted to get them to rematch in a long fight because the first fight was 10 rounds of that year. They wanted a 45 rounder, to really settle matters. And part of the reason they got the purse they did and that they got a percentage, they 25% each, I think, of the film rights, was because there was a bidding war and sort of the leverage that these athletes had in the framework of like the club and promoter mix that was happening at the time in the US. So I'm sort of like trying to study that and find ways to write about it in my book project to reflect the nuance, especially like, I don't think they do it so much today, but back then, if you had a big fight booked and you lost a fight on the way to that big fight, your opponent might end up in that big fight. Promoters would replace athletes, this, 86, promoters would replace athletes with the guy who beat them. It wasn't like today, like, oh, I have a contract, you absolutely can do nothing. So when Langford and Flynn were fighting, the fight with Ketchel, there were discussions about what that meant. Same thing with Jim Barry, who fought Langford a billion times, but he had fights where he was trying to win the fight to get another opportunity, or he was going to be matched with the winner of a different fight. So that's kind of where I'm on right now. Sorry about it if there's any noise, brother.
Oh, yeah, a little bit, but no, it's perfectly fine. I think we heard you nice and clear there. I got your point across. I think that's awesome right there. The great Sam Langford, someone we often discuss on this channel. So that's big time for sure. Sam Langford, if you don't know, you got to look him up, folks, especially if you're new to the sport of boxing and new to history, because there are many people who are familiarized with more of the mainstream part of boxing. But Sam Langford, when you bring up a name like that, then we know for sure that you're talking about the history of boxing. And I think that when you take that into account, of course, you can learn a lot of things that probably don't translate in the same manner here these days. And Sam Langford is one of those guys who ultimately is an enigma in the sport. And this is for the competition side of things, what he was able to do and accomplish in the sport there. So that is someone certainly worth watching. And we're going to give you more info on him. That's why we always talk about him. Arguably the greatest fighter ever. I know you've heard of Sugar Ray Leonard. Sugar Ray Robinson, who was regarded as the greatest fighter by many pundits alike. But Sam Langford, if you don't know, certainly once you research, you'll find out that is the most formidable fighting man to step foot in the squared circle, as they call it. Shout out to Dan here again, who, as Kingfish Levinsky was a very good fighter, but yeah, Dempsey beat him up in his 40s. Yes, that is the case right there. It was an exhibition, I believe, when the two went at it. So, yeah, Kingfish Levinsky, he's in there with some top-level competition throughout, including the likes of Max Baer. Of course, we know he was in there with Joe Louis, even though it only lasted a round, but very battle-tested in terms of one of those contenders there from the yesteryears, as we say. But, yeah, hey, a name that many probably won't know, but certainly you're going to find out about him. Dan mentions Dempsey beat up 4 thugs in the street when he was in his 70s. He said he took it easy, only body shots. They were lying helpless until the cops came. Yeah, I heard of that story there, Dan. I have heard of that. And, hey, no question that some of that skill set, that mindset in terms of knowing what to do and how to throw those punches that never leaves you, of course. And they mentioned that the power is the last thing to leave when you're a fighter. And I think that holds true. We saw George Foreman not too long ago punching on a heavy bag, and he was putting some great weight into it. And you can see he still has a good deal of pop to him. We know a lot of fighters fought at an older age. Even back in the day, we've seen world champions more here in modern times, world champion by the standards of what we consider to be the world championships or a world championship title, with Bernard Hopkins being the oldest. And of course, that happened here in the 2000s or the 2010s rather, and George Foreman becoming the world champion in 2000 or 1990s. So we see more of that in some fighters boxing for longer, I would say. But that being said, even back then, there were a lot of guys who were fighting at extensive ages. I mean, the great Archie Moore, even Sam Langford fought well past his time frame. I know you know a good deal about that in itself right there, Random, in terms of Langford fighting beyond his most formidable days, but still being a real player and challenger. And there were those that still did not want to fight him, even though he was at an older age.
Yeah, Langford suffered that. You know, he was in his late 30s keeping a winning record with a busy schedule, you know. And by that point, by the late teens, he couldn't beat Harry Wills, but, you know, almost no one else in the boxing ranks was a Harry Wills. So it was like a sort of a unique. There were some other guys, too, that gave him trouble when he got older and was less mobile. But, yeah, guys can be way dangerous past their prime. Look at James Toney. That's a great example. Because Bernard Hopkins stayed in shape, right? But James Toney, he was kind of bulbous, but he could fight. He had beautiful instincts, and he gave trouble to guys who were in perfect shape because of his... No, he wasn't like Langford, whoever was like 133 and going up. Because, you know, in high school, Toney was a 200-pound quarterback. He cut down to middle. You know, he dieted and cut that 40 pounds difference. But Langford was someone who was very just
coming in a little broken up on us there, we couldn't hear that piece of it. You came in.
Sorry, brother. Is this any better?
Yes, you're clear now.
Yeah, so like even like Jim Flynn, like he was like a million miles past his prime when he beat Jack Dempsey in 1917. Like he was far gone, but he had the experience and he pulled out a trick that Dempsey didn't know yet. He learned it, but he didn't know it yet. And that was something that the papers said that Flynn got from Langford, who he had lost to. Well, he'd already beaten him once and lost to him twice years before then. So, yeah, guys can be dangerous past prime. Even lots of, like you said, lots of notable people have fought late in their careers. It's just that they're less likely to be successful and be remembered for doing so.
Yeah, it's very interesting, you know, when you really think about it. And it's one of those things because you can say that age, it treats everyone a little bit differently. Some are able to stand the test of time and some aren't necessarily. Now, there are those that have the style to allow for such, and then you see that there are some styles that ultimately end up washing out fairly quickly. Especially some of the more aggressive fighters whose styles are built on largely taking punches to get their punches. And we've seen how that has affected things. Real quick, shout out to my mom dropped in here. Shout out to your mom, says, hello, son of guest, make it do what it do. Hey, we're going to do that here with Random Acoustic Thoughts. Of course, Random History, 86 Boxing. We're talking to history, folks. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Of course, we like to talk way back, as I mentioned before. I mean, we can do 1800s. We can do early 1900s. We can even do some of the more modern history, but certainly we prefer to chat about that from yesteryears. A term I said once again earlier. But that being said, yeah, we've seen how certain styles can kind of wash out quickly in sports or in the world of boxing, as mentioned, just given sort of the nature of it and the damage taken. Then there are those that stand the test of time a bit longer. I mentioned the Bernard Hopkins, another crafty fighter similar to that of James Toney, another guy who was crafty and he could take his style up in weight because he just learned those skill sets and those fundamentals and had an understanding of the game, understanding of where to turn and contort his body, where and how to throw punches, how to absorb punches, how to turn from or with punches. So a mix of all of that. And you saw some of that back in the day as well, because as mentioned, there were fighters who could fight for longer periods. That being said, there were also those who, by the time they hit 30, they were pretty much past it, or at least close to it. I think of the likes of Harry Greb. I mean, his better days were most certainly behind him by the time he hit 30. But by that same token, this was a situation not unlike many back then, where you had a guy with hundreds of fights right there. Harry Greb, a guy who fought in the neighborhood of 300 fights or more. So just think about that. And this doesn't include, say, if you're doing some exhibitions, and then we know sparring plays a big role in the sport as well. So they were sparring back then during those time frames as well. Now, some of them didn't have extensive and amateur careers compared to what we see today, because it's not uncommon today to see some fighters, especially those out of Eastern Europe, some of the Uzbek fighters, the Ukrainian fighters, the Kazakh fighters, they might have 200-300 fights or more than that, as a matter of fact. And that's not uncommon. So these guys are coming in with a lot of competition under the belt, a lot of experience under the belt. And while the amateur doesn't necessarily always translate to 100% success in the pro ranks, no question about it, once you have that level or the degree of fight totals under your belt on the amateur side, you're going to step into the pro game a lot more seasoned than the typical fighter who hasn't fought as much. But I would say anytime you're in the hundreds or more, that is the case.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about Kingfish Levinsky, but I know he had a really tough professional career. He had mixed results, but he sure went up against it. But I don't know if he did any amateur work. I know with Langford, he had, to my understanding, 3 amateur fights. Possibly only because the next one got him kicked out of the amateur thing because he was on a professional card. I don't know if he got paid for that 3rd fight with Jack McVicker, but the AAU kicked him out, and McVicker, so he was a pro by default at that point. So that's what people call his pro debut. One thing that's interesting is, like, there are guys, as they aged, they were still dangerous, but the way their style made the fights, made or broke their results, got more polarized as they got older. Jim Flynn was like that. He was still dangerous. He smacked the heck out of Dempsey in 1917, but he was still able late in his career to beat certain guys, and then other guys could just school him because he had lost maybe some edge. But he's unique because he was a real battler. He was an in-your-face, clinch-in, throwing hooks, like headbutts, shoulders, all kinds of stuff, But he actually had quite a lot of longevity. Even after getting smacked around by Langford in their March rematch in 1910, like, he won his next 9 in a row, and 8 of those guys he stopped. Knocked out Al Kaufman, Carl Morris, the White Hopes. So, like, Jim Flynn was, some people were saying he was over, but he wasn't over. And then he fought Jack Johnson, who snapped that streak. But even after that, he was still a dangerous cat in spite of his style, or maybe because of it. But most guys, they pay the price as they get older if they're very, very aggressive. They just take too much damage.
Yeah. No, that's not uncommon. That's certainly not uncommon, but no, you pointed out some good things right there. You mentioned some names there. Carl Morris, of course. One of the White Hopes. He did go up against Fred Fulton a number of times, for those that don't know. We have a video on the channel chronicling that. Real quick, shout out to Dan, says Jim Mace had his last fight at 78, died at 79. Insane. I know he was fighting there at the older age. And I know he was still competing and still pretty tough. As a matter of fact, even when he was competing at an older age, he was tough outing for some of the younger fighters that were out there on the come up, and
Yeah, that's wild.
yeah, doing their thing in that nature. He also mentions Jack Johnson fought till his 60s. Oh, Jack, yeah, he went past it as well. A lot of fighters, hey, when you have that fighting in your blood and your genes, then that tends to happen. Yeah, certainly. Hey, and we see it today as well. We see it today with some boxers who ultimately, yeah, they probably stay a little bit past it, but these guys, yeah, still competing. And hey, the thing that is prevalent, or at least you see some of it more now than we probably saw in the past, as far as like this kind of period or era we're in, are exhibitions. So I don't mind that. So you have some of the older guys doing exhibitions. That was like a big thing, a major part of the sport back during the periods that we're talking about. If you look at the guys like James J. Corbett, he only had about, I want to say, 24 fights officially. But as far as his exhibitions, they far outweigh the amount of fights he had. He had tons of those, and there was money in exhibitions, and that's something that happened with John L. Sullivan as well. So if you look on the likes of, say, BoxRec or whatever, then yeah, you're going to see only about 39 fights there, or 40 fights. I believe it's 40 fights, 38 1-1. And the thing about it, it doesn't take into account a number of the fights that were considered exhibitions, which really could be disguised back in those days. And a lot of that was due to some of the laws and regulations surrounding prize fighting as a whole. So it would
Absolutely,
be
86.
exhibitions, you know.
And even the way, like as far as the historical record going way back, even the way that the press reported the fight, the language that was used sometimes related to proposed or actual legislation that would affect the sport. Like in Maine, I've been researching, I jump around within Langford's career. Just if I get bored, I just switch to a different year. So he fought Luther Manuel and Arthur Cote, both out of Maine. Cote was out of Biddeford, and I think Manuel was out of Portland, Maine, but I've been digging up fights that aren't in the record, right? But in the Maine newspapers, they would call it sparring. But it wasn't sparring, it was a fight. They would make clear if there was no decision rendered or a prearranged draw, but it was just the language they were using. But at different times, you know, when people are trying to snuff something out, I noticed in 1903, in the lead up to the early '04 ban on boxing in Boston, one of the main writers in the city, Rob Roy, he was talking about New York fighters coming into town and then doing side bets, was showing the authorities, the state authorities, that it was prize fighting rather than sport. Like that was actually, like, they were considered separate things in some circles, and that was an argument against it, that it was really just prize fighting.
Yeah.
And so the language that people used to, you know, they were aware that the language being used would affect it. Now, some people going back, they put the definition of sparring now onto every instance they see of that word. Same with exhibition, but a wonderful exhibition of boxing could just be a good display of technique or a good fight. It doesn't necessarily mean it's today's version of exhibition. At the same time, guys like Fitz, you said, and other guys too, especially Corbett, because he just had that one defense against Charlie Mitchell, and that was it for all those years he held the belt. He was on a theater tour, mostly in the American South, and the exhibitions would happen during the theater. Sam Langford himself did theater exhibitions, often sparring his team, his actual, you know, the guys on his team, Bob Armstrong, George Byers, but sometimes other people too. It was just another way to make money. And like the influencer boxing of today, that some people, they don't really like what it seems to imply about where things are heading. But that stuff's, people making money has been around forever. And money with less risk has always been appealing. It was appealing to Fitz. It was appealing to Corbett, because they were like, and Johnson, Jack Johnson, and other guys, they were like, well, I can make X dollars doing this. My title's not on the line. You got to really bring some money if you want me to fight this long fight. And just like the purses would get larger for long fights, like the time I'm studying, they still considered a 45 rounder or a finish fight to be the actual way to settle matters at title level. Wasn't always the case, but that was considered that by the purists.
Oh, yeah.
They were They were like, middleweight is 154 pounds, like when Fitz beat Dempsey, and you better be going to a finish. You know, like there was that attitude. I had mentioned Langford's fight with Stanley Ketchel in April of 1910. Well, there was a lot of drama because multiple promoters in different, not just cities, but different countries had offered big purses to try and get them in longer fights. And some of the press were writing about the 6-rounder in Philly, even though it was probably the biggest 6-rounder to that date, up to that point in history when they fought in Philly. They were saying, oh, this is going to be one of those 6 or 10 round affairs where they both, you know, can look okay, and then they'll have a big rematch to a finish or to a 45 rounder. And there were offers on the table, especially California, before the governor nixed that idea. This was back when it looked like Jeffries Johnson, the super fight, would happen in California. Well, Langford, people were trying to book Langford to fight either Stanley Ketchel or the ex-champion Tommy Burns, like 2 days before the fight, before the Jeffries Johnson fight, because there would already be people in town. It would be a big fight as well, like draw more people in to travel to the area for the event. So didn't end up happening. They moved it to Nevada, and then Ketchel turned down the proposed 45 rounder. But he had agreed on very unequal financial terms prior to that on a long fight. His manager agreed, but the split was 20 grand to Ketchel plus expenses plus some guarantees. And then Langford was offered 5 grand, and his manager was like, you guys are crazy.
Yeah.
Especially as Langford was, I don't know if he was as big as, like, they were probably both 2 of the 4 or 5 biggest names in the sport, right? You had Tommy Burns, Jack Johnson, you had Ketchel and Langford, and then you had Jeffries, who was retired, but still like immeasurably huge as a star. And a lot of people, even years after he quit the game, still thought he could beat them all. Like Tommy Burns, when he took over the title thing after he beat Marvin Hart, who'd won the inaugural new iteration, you know, he had to do a lot to prove himself because he was in Jeffrey's shadow. Everyone was in Jeffrey's shadow because of the way the wider public saw him. But Tommy Burns made his money. You know, they weren't all tough fights, but he was like, if you meet my price, I'm gonna show up and beat that guy. And he went around the world and he fought the English champ, the French. I don't know if he fought the French champ. He was gonna fight Sam McVeigh. He was gonna cross the color line and fight Sam McVeigh, but that one didn't happen over the money. Because there is that money has always been a factor. Langford, McVeigh, other guys lost out on fights, especially colored fighters, because even if their opponent was white and a star, and someone met his demand, that doesn't mean the same promoter is going to meet the other athlete's demand, even if it's not the same money value. So this old 80-20, 70-30 split nonsense, like all that discussion, I shouldn't call it nonsense, in boxing and prize fighting is age old. Fitz used to hold out for money. He's like, 10 grand is not enough. I need more. In fact, Tommy Burns, when he finally agreed to a unification fight with the colored champion, Jack Johnson, it was because he was guaranteed the equivalent of 30 grand US, win, lose, or draw. And Johnson, part of how, even though he had already signed to fight Langford, like 6 months later or 5 months later, he pulled that back. He wanted more money. He wanted that kind of guarantee to fight Langford. So even though the National Sporting Club in London was offering 25 grand to be split however the athlete saw it, Johnson was like, no, dude, that's not even my fee to take on that kind of danger.
And I think to take on Burns, didn't Langford get, or didn't Johnson get only like 5,000?
He got the equivalent of 5 grand. Okay. So I'm assuming they paid him in Australian currency, but a lot of times back then in the paper, they would just, if it was unless it was in England, but if they're talking about a fight in England, they just go ahead and convert the currency to USD. Yeah. So so if you look in the paper for some of these purses, and you're like, 1,200 is not the same as what I read. Well, that's because you might be reading pounds compared to what the dollar equivalent was. So sources are important. A broad look at sources helps pick through the information and find the truth in the middle, instead of just haggling over like number values without any context. You know this. You research guys like Fulton. There were a lot of.
Oh yeah.
You know, that's one of my favorite of your videos. I really enjoyed that because he's not a guy that has a lot of info out there prior to you doing the video. There is some, but not a great deal. And like negotiations, because he was trying to get that title shot himself. He was one of the guys. Maybe you could speak on that a little bit.
Oh yeah. So yeah. The great Fred Fulton, for sure. I have no problem speaking on that real quick. Shout out to Dan, who mentions Burns was just a middleweight too. He was dominant middleweight and went up to heavyweight just for money. Certainly. Yeah, make no mistake about it. Heavyweight was that marquee brand in the sport. It always had been from a historic standpoint. And even when you look at it today, people want to see the big guys in there and going at it. But certainly it was one of those situations with Fred Fulton where, hey, this man deserved a shot at the world heavyweight championship, and ultimately that did not happen. His reign or his opportunity to actually obtain a reign came at the time that Jess Willard had the world heavyweight title. Of course, we know he was the one that dethroned Jack Johnson 1916 and or 1915. Was it 15 or 16? Do you recall?
15.
15, okay. And so in between, and put this on for size, during his reign, Jess Willard, that is, he only had the draw in a defense against Frank Moran, and then, of course, he lost his title to Jack Dempsey. That's 4 years. Within that 4 years, let's think about that. But he was doing stuff with theater, etc., as well.
Right, that's almost as inactive as Corbett as far as actual title fights.
Yeah, relative to the amount of years you had the belt. So, yeah, during that time, Fred Fulton had rose up to the point where he was the legitimate challenger for that world heavyweight title. And I think he would have actually beat Jess Willard because I think he had more power, despite Jess being a big, strong guy with endurance, of course. I do think that more power would have been on the side of Fred Fulton. So if you look at his resume, he had a ton of knockouts in his, I want to say, 70-plus wins. And he's really a guy that is a sleeper. But one of the things that held it back, of course, you could say a bit of it, kind of the intention of the champion, and then some of the financial aspect, I guess you can say, to a certain degree. But he was at one point going to actually face Jess Willard, and he ended up being replaced by Frank Moran because the promoters down in New Orleans, I believe, I think it was the New Orleans, I want to say Sporting Club, but one of the clubs there in New Orleans, and essentially they had come to agreement that it would be Willard versus Fulton, and they started to get cold feet just thinking about the financial gain, etc., and switched out Fulton with Moran because they felt that Moran had a bigger name, and that certainly was subjective, but no question that Fulton was the top guy, the top contender at that particular juncture, because this would have come right before Dempsey sort of went on his run, and a little bit before Harry Wills, his name got out there, and he hit his prime as well, and it ultimately did not materialize. So Willard fought a draw with Frank Moran in a matchup that some felt that Moran actually won, and we know what happened when he stepped in there with Jack Dempsey. And it just so happens that Fulton would go on to face Dempsey and Willard, Dempsey and Wills, in what would have been kind of 2 points in which he could have furthered his name or furthered his step towards a title shot, but he was knocked out by both of those guys. The first round against Dempsey, and for Willard, I don't remember the exact round, but I want to say in the neighborhood of 3 or 4, somewhere in there, the third or fourth round, one of the two. And it just goes to show that, hey, sometimes that timing is precious in the sport. And when someone, say, ducks or they choose to take on lesser competition, whatever it may be, and you're at the top of your game, or you're really streaking or reaching that point where you're hitting your prime and you put in that work, just a sidestep of any nature that could derail the rest of history for certain fighters. And in the case of Fulton, he is not as big a name as he probably should be because of the fact that he wasn't able to get that shot at the title and people know of Jess Willard, but if you really boil it down and look at what Fulton was able to accomplish in the sport, certainly a better fighter than Jess Willard, as far as I'm concerned, and should be a bigger name than Jess Willard. So
he should be a bigger name. And if I can add, at the time, because I jumped forward and looked a little bit at this time. You know, I've looked through Langford's career. I just spent most of my time in one section of it, but yeah, like Willard, a lot of people weren't so hot on him, but they were like, if he doesn't beat Johnson, Johnson might retire undefeated, and then Langford is likely to be the guy who takes over, and the white people won't get the title back. So there were hopes with Willard, but a lot of people were kind of down on him because he got schooled by Gunboat Smith, who wasn't a large guy. He was heavier than middleweight at the time, and that was the same year Smith got a win over Langford. Gunboat Smith, red hot in 1913. But if title opportunities are limited, a lot of these guys, they could do great work or have busy, awesome seasons, but just not enough to stay in contention or stay in top form long enough to capitalize on an opportunity. And that happened to Fulton. His most famous fights are the ones he lost, but he had some good wins in there, including mushing up Sam Langford's eye in their first fight and blinding him in one eye. So, I mean, Fulton could really hit. I think I agree with you that he would have done pretty well against Willard. It's very likely. He seems like he was a better boxer, and he was big enough that he had enough crack in his shots that he could land some telling punches on. With that frame, that long frame of his, he could have landed some stuff, or even just jab the hell out of Willard, you know, and take it on points. So I think he had a good shot, but yeah, timing's important, especially back then, at a time when people were expected to do a lot of work to continually prove they were the guy. That's what happened to Langford. Like, he fought busy years and he just couldn't get a unification opportunity, even though he held Johnson's old colored heavyweight title and Johnson had the title, and neither of them was a white guy. He couldn't get his opportunity anyway because of money and the fact that Johnson saw opportunity in fighting other people, fighting, you know, Al Kaufman, fighting Jim Flynn. Like, Langford stopped Flynn in their rematch, you know, stopped him in 8 rounds, brutalized him, right? So badly that it amplified the rumors that he had carried Flynn 5 weeks earlier. Like, even though that's not necessarily the case, Langford was really pissed at the decision. It was a newspaper decision, but he was really pissed. And actually, incidentally, where people talk about newspaper decisions, are they real or not? Well, in the newspapers following the first and then the second 1910 Langford-Flynn fight, you know, one of the newspapers explicitly put it, said 2 out of 3 ringside newspapers had it for Flynn, which is a win. They went ahead and said it because, you know, like, people are like the idea of the consensus of the newspaper writers at ringside. It wasn't some sort of weird thing we're inventing after the fact. This is how people had to do it because they had to get around the legislation to make their bets. They had to get around the legislation to know who was in contention and who wasn't, even after a no decision fight. It's just how it was. But I think that also, the no decision fights also robs some people of their true record. Because, you know, 86, there are some guys, if you take out no decisions, they don't have that many fights. Like, I mean, not compared to the full record, like Jack O'Brien, maybe 100, less than 115 fights, 2 decision, or no decisions where he got a finish, which, you know, makes it a moot point at that point. You can, you know, you're allowed to finish someone in a no decision. It's just, if you don't finish them and there's no DQ, then there's no official result. But his fight count goes up to, I think, 190 something or 180 something.
Oh yeah.
If you count that. Same with Langford. He had a huge number of fights to decision or fights that he didn't let go to the distance. He also had a bunch of no decision fights. And that, trying to think of the most egregious example of someone's, maybe Dave Hawley. Dave Hawley's fight count, because he was a Philly fighter. Philly's 6-round no decisions was the thing. That's where he had most of his fights. Even though he had some great performances and he challenged Joe Gans, the great Joe Gans, he didn't win, but he challenged great Joe Gans.
Yeah.
He's not remembered like he should be because there are avenues by which someone could view the sport through a certain prism, which would rob him of his credit. Just like if you go with Fulton, you start with who are their most famous opponents? How did he do? Doesn't tell the full story. And your video on Fulton gives him a lot of his due credit. No, I come back to that one a lot. I really like that. What was your favorite to research? Do you have a project, like a historical project, that was your most enjoyable on your end?
Good question right there. Good question for sure. I'm thinking about that. There have been so many of them. I'll tell you, I would say that one that probably, well, I say the two that were probably my most favorite in terms of going through that process of research outside of the Fulton one. I would put that in that same bucket. But I would say two that really kind of stood out for me. No, three that really stood out for me out of all the ones that I've done. Of course, one being in no particular order, but one of them was Harry Wills, doing the video on him. Another one, Tommy Ryan, and then the third was Harry Lewis. So those three are probably the three most that, man, I was really just tied in.
Those were all really good. Yeah, I could tell with the Tommy Ryan, you put the hours in, man. That was because he's a guy who comes up. He has some from one angle, he's like, wow, what a great fighter. He also has some baggage, like he didn't want to fight Joe Walcott. He was drawing the color line at times, or all the time. I'm not sure which, but he was a great fighter, and he had some tough fights. And your video really, that's one thing I appreciate about your work, 86. You give credit, even if there's baggage there, and a lot of fighters have different kinds of baggage.
Oh yeah, certainly.
Relative to the official record, but giving full credit is important because otherwise we have to start weighing baggage.
Oh yeah, most certainly.
And instead of just talking about someone's complete and complicated story, a lot of these guys have, and it's the same thing today, where from one angle you look at Canelo, and a lot of people would argue, well, he's the greatest of like the guys that are still going, possibly. Other people would be able to point out a lot of things that add some nuance to the picture. The truth is probably somewhere between the 2 points. For most people, if they were just unbiased, if they weren't attached to it emotionally at all. But it's just important to tell someone's whole story, and that gives someone the opportunity to evaluate it. Because like Langford, his career is like that. It's not an easy story to tell. That's partly why I've been having some debates with myself about how far to take the book from 1902 until when, because he doesn't have a happy ending. He died blind and broke, and he never won he never unified the titles, because the guy who held the colored title before him wouldn't fight him for what had previously been the white title. So he trying to figure out how to turn that. It's like, it's not so much a story as an analysis of some seasons. A lot of guys have that kind of career. Like, how do you do a feel-good Fred Fulton story? It's a tough one because he couldn't get his opportunity, but he should be respected, especially as a puncher, man. That guy really knew how to use his frame, put some artillery on people. Wilder wasn't the first lanky guy to be knocking people's heads off. He could really crack. And Andy actually had a jab.
Yeah, he
bonus, not taking a dig at Wilder or anything, but he's a lanky guy who's more of like a heavy artillery. But Fulton could actually box as well, and so it's good for these guys to get their credit, whatever that might end up being when the full picture is told.
I think you're on point with that, and you made me think about it. Probably one of the other videos that and it's hard to really just kind of boil them down. But one I learned so much about, and I really appreciated that I was able to do, was one on Denver Ed Martin, because he's one of those guys. If you look at his record at face value, say you just go to BoxRec and look at his record, I don't think it does full justice just in terms of how good of a fighter he was and kind of where he started, then kind of that middle portion when he hit his peak, and then kind of where he started to go down, or where his slide came, essentially. And I think he played such an integral part in the sport that was highlighted somewhat, that gets overshadowed because he, of course, fought in the era where you had the likes of Sam McVeigh. You had James Jeffries, you had Jack Johnson, and he crossed paths in some way or another with these guys. Gus Rulin, that was another one who ultimately ended up becoming a training mate, a stable mate of his, who he did a lot of exhibitions, sparring sessions with, etc. And that's one thing that is kind of not unlike what we see today. A lot of these boxers, they knew each other, they competed, they sparred together, despite what it may look like on the surface, and despite these individuals, some of these white fighters drawing the color line in actual competition, that what doesn't mean that they weren't accustomed to sparring and dealing with some of these black fighters. We really look at it and take that into account. James J. Jeffrey was very familiar with Bob Armstrong, one of his kind of chief sparring buddies right there.
Right, he fought Armstrong. They fought I think it was to a draw. Yep. And from what I saw in the papers, Jeffries gasped so hard, him and his manager left for the other coast, and it kind of, maybe that played into him not being too keen to fight across racial lines. Like, he had a bad experience. Jack Dempsey got his ribs jacked up by Jack Lester Johnson. Maybe it was a little bit of that too. Not wanting to fight the even heavier, the even better colored fighters because of his experiences there. You also there's a lot of PR and involved where people will put up something that's mildly plausible as a reason, but it may not be the actual reason for their behavior. So again, it's just important sometimes to tell the story. I'm doing that in my book. I'm basically trying to go from direct sources, contemporary sources, not people's memoirs. And I'm just saying what I found rather than what happened. Like, this person reported this. This appears to have been the case. This may relate to this, but I'm not actually making these definitive statements because I'm not Doctor Who. I ain't got a TARDIS. I can't go watch, so all I can do is use my whatever small intelligence I have to try and present, and then the information in a way that isn't biased to one conclusion or another. Because Langford had his own controversies. He wasn't completely controversy free. He was supposed to fight Al Kaufman a couple times. Now, one of those times, the regulations of California screwed up the fight, but the other time he left the city short notice when they wouldn't give him a guarantee up front. But there was talk, including by Kaufman's manager, who by the next year was no longer his manager, saying that Kaufman was going to pay Langford $5,000 to have an easy go. And then he came in obviously in shape for a real fight, and Langford was spooked because he hadn't trained seriously because it was supposed to be a gentleman's agreement. Now, I don't know if that was the case. Langford maintained that he only ever made agreements with himself, basically keeping guys looking competitive so he could have another fight with them, get it paid again. But the truth, who knows? But I'm just putting everything in there that I feel is relevant because different people will see it different way. And I'm way too close to the action at this point to make cold decisions on what's definitely anything or definitely isn't. So yeah, just one of those things, man. Context and critical thinking.
No, I think that's legit. That is solid right there. And it's great putting it in this perspective, getting this historical context behind some of these great fighters from the past and some of the competition that went down during those periods. But yeah, I think that's one of the more rewarding things that thinking about the history of the sport is, while we see different things here in modern times that may ultimately be new to us, that doesn't mean it was necessarily new to the sport in itself. So that's what you find out when you really dive into the history of the sport. You find
that's
out
absolutely true. People switching managers, promoter bidding wars, athletes taking the easier money, even if it's less, but it's like the ratio of danger to money is better, even if they don't get as much in totality. Like all those things, weight classes, agreements, cash draining your opponent, making them come down. That's not new either. Or guys missing weight, fighting. Missing weight is a calculation, losing the forfeit over making weight, but possibly calculating that it's ultimately more likely to be more profitable if they do that. That stuff has all happened. Last minute demands and things like that. Ray Robinson, one of the guys who's famous for that. I need more. But he didn't invent that. Langford and McVeigh, according to Hugh McIntosh, the Australian promoter who promoted, Johnson, the Burns Johnson unification and a bunch of fights for Langford, and tried to bring Johnson out to fight Langford in Australia and Jeanette out to Australia. But he said that they gave him that. They needed more money thing. And that may have actually have some weight, because I think Langford attributed that to the fact that his manager, Woodman, had a bit of a gambling problem. He said the last time he fought Jim Barry in Australia, he just did that to pay a gambling debt. He didn't even get any money from winning that fight. And that was a fast finish fight. Barry claimed injury, and he ran off, and there was a big stink about it. But he might have just got hit real hard. Langford could hit awfully hard. But again, I don't actually know. I just see what the different people are saying and what their proximity is to the action. Because it's easy, even a week later, I find stuff that's plain wrong in the newspapers, verifiably wrong, from just a week later in a paper in the same region. It's like there's not, or spelling names wrong, or getting specific facts. Last thing I'll say, because I got to go into work, I found an article someone published saying that Jack Blackburn was mistaken for Booker T. Washington at the train station on his way to fight Sam Langford.
That's funny.
And they had the whole thing, and it's a great story. The problem was Blackburn withdrew from that bout, and it was Sam Langford who had stepped in to replace him. It was someone else fighting Langford. And so the story, in light of that, the story has less credibility, because the circumstances of the replacement booking kind of make that impossible. Even though a young Booker T. Washington, he wasn't young by then, but a young Booker T. Washington does favor Jack Blackburn. So there's a kernel of, like I was saying on the last show, it's a kernel of truth in there that gets elaborated on, doesn't make it true. And in that case, it would be very hard for it to be true, because it wouldn't make any sense. He was the one who was sick and couldn't fight. So it's just one of those things, man. It's like people take liberties. We're trying to sort through it all to figure out what actually happened. And that, I find that more interesting than the myths.
I see that a little bit Booker T and Jack.
Oh, look at Dan shouting out Hank Griffin. He was a tough character, him.
Oh yeah, he was mentioning Jeffries fighting Hank Griffin. Yeah, he was a pretty tough character right there. I did a video on Hank. I wanted to do a larger one. These are some guys I want to dive into a bit more, because they're some of the unsung heroes of making the era of heavyweights during those periods one of the top heroes. You know what I'm saying? So definitely want to dive into those guys a bit more.
Yeah, 86. I realize it's 8. I got to go in. I got to start slinging pallets around. Man, this has been good. Shout out to the chat. Thanks for the feedback, everybody. 86. I'll catch you on the in the back later on. I'll give you a call.
All right. Appreciate you there, Random. Have a good one.
All right, brother. Take care, everybody.
All right, folks. We appreciate you checking us out here. Of course, Random Acoustic Thoughts. Give them a like. Give them a subscription if you can. Those that are here, of course. Random Acoustic Thoughts on YouTube, at Random Acoustic Thoughts or something of that nature. I'm sure if you search it and you see anything boxing related, then it's going to be Random Acoustic Thoughts for sure. Shout out to my man Moss in the building here. Mossberg, what's good with your famo? Appreciate you there. Be sure to give him a like and subscribe, of course. My man Moss in the building there. Toughest fighter Jack Justin ever fought, Hank Griffin. Oh, yeah, Hank Griffin was a tough one for sure. Hank Griffin, underrated fighter right there. He was in with some tip-top names. Guy, he stood about 6 feet tall. Solidly built fighter. We don't have any video footage of him. There are some pictures out there, of course. I did a video on him. But yeah, he could give any fighters a run. And one of the things is, of course, like how we talk about sparring, things of that nature. Yeah, he had work that he put in. So he's one of those guys who certainly had the mettle to be able to last with some of these top tier opponents here during these periods. So that is a good name to bring up right there. Dan says Random is one great content creator. Indeed, there, Dan. Indeed, appreciate Random Acoustic Thoughts there, folks. Be sure to check him out. He goes in, does his research, really doing a lot of work on Sam Langford, as mentioned. So if you aren't familiar with Sam Langford, that would be a good channel to start. Right there, Random Acoustic Thoughts. He'll tell you and dive into a lot of things regarding the great Sam Langford, the Boston Bone Crusher there. Even on this channel, we've had some discussions on it. But if you were to ask me, hey, where do I go or where can I start? If I were to start to get some inkling of the fighter that Sam Langford was, I myself am going to direct you to Random Acoustic Thoughts. And yeah, I hope to one day in the future do a larger video with him that is more of a documentary style that focuses on Sam Langford. I know there are some out there on YouTube already, but I just feel the in-depth nature of such, the detail that he has, etc., could make it something super special out there and give a different view and vibe or feel than what is out there already, you know. And we see that sometimes with other historic figures, artifacts, items, etc. So that's the thought behind it. But yeah, appreciate you there, Moss. Indeed, appreciate you there. But yeah, we're here talking a little boxing history, and it's really just kind of random boxing history in terms of just anything brought up in general, whether there are questions, comments regarding specifics to history, things of that nature. And one of the things, of course, I always mention, certainly love the later eras. Thinking late 1800s, early 1900s, mid 1900s even. But those are types of things that are subjects that we love. So look at the channel and think about some of the historic stuff on there. It really centers on those time periods. But we do have some modern stuff. So as of late, been doing a lot of modern interviews with some fighters who are actually fighting here right now to this day. But yeah, certainly looking to continue to expand upon the history aspect. And oh yeah, I will note that you heard Random there. He mentioned the book, so he is working on a book. It's going to be, I think, one that will prove beneficial to those that want to dive a bit more into the career of Sam Langford. He always gives his nods to Clay Moyle's book on Sam Langford as a great book that really details his history, fighting career, etc. Random is taking it a bit deeper. It's going to be a bit more in the weeds on specific eras of Langford's career. So you get to know the guy, know the man, the human there in some of those earlier days, for instance. So I so totally look forward to it once it actually arrives. So kudos to you, Random, and I'll be looking towards that book coming out. But yeah, so yeah, again, we're talking some boxing history. I mentioned some of the things that I'm working on. Of course, there's always a multitude of different styles and or different areas of history generally around this same era, but different areas that I'm looking into. I mentioned watching a bunch of older fight footage. That's always kind of rewarding, revealing. You get to see how some of the older guys operated, and they could fight. Make no mistake about it. They were skilled. And that's one of the things that I always try to point out whenever we're talking history and whatnot. So, hey, going to continue to do that and hope to come with more videos. I actually have a few scripts that are smaller that are almost ready to go, all but ready to go. Just need to do some recording. And of course, there's the editing aspect. But once that is complete, I'll definitely get that to you. And in the meantime, as a placeholder, in some sense, I've done some of those where I'm just kind of speaking on boxing history, not unlike this live video here, and just speaking on certain scenarios, some of the comments. So, hey, keep dropping the comments on the videos, and definitely I'll try to get to and check every single one of them. Show some love. I appreciate the love for sure. Keeps me going. Hey, be sure to like this video. If you don't subscribe and you're listening, wherever you may be sure to give us a subscription. And we're going to keep coming with these videos and discussions, content surrounding the history, and more. And we appreciate every single one of you. No doubt. Again, thanks to my man Random Acoustic Thoughts who dropped by, showed some love. Twice we had a couple of discussions. And hey, this is all good. All feeds into the history of the sport. Hey, more to come for sure. So be on the lookout there. Shout out to all who dropped by this particular chat. My man Dan the man, my man Moss in this thing. My mom dropped by here. Then some others. Oh, Ankza. Hey, appreciate you, Ankza. But of course, this isn't the full end. We'll be back probably pretty soon, as a matter of fact. So be on the lookout. Check what's in tow because we are coming back here. But thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your night. I appreciate all of you.